I'd like to welcome you all here to this evening's event, which is featuring the short films of Maya Deren. I'm very pleased to welcome Eleanor Cleghorn, who will be introducing a selection of Deren's films tonight. Eleanor comes fresh from programming a season at the BFI, which commemorated the 50th anniversary of Deren's death. The season was a collaboration between the BFI and the London Consortium, where Eleanor is a PhD candidate. Those of you who have seen the group exhibition already there, curated by Klaus Weber, will know that Maya Deren's film Meshes of the Afternoon features as one of a handful of audiovisual works within the exhibition. Klaus Weber is a huge fan of Maya Deren's work, and he was very keen to include her film because it really chimes with the experimental, surreal and sometimes hallucinatory feel of the works in the group show. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to expand out from this exhibition and present a wider selection of Deren's fantastic back catalogue of films for you. This event is part of an extensive programme of screenings, performances and live events that have been programmed alongside the exhibitions. Coming up is an evening of Jean Pan-Levé films on the 17th of November, introduced by director Brigitte Berg. Between now and Christmas, we'll also be welcoming a host of speakers, including Alex Vasudevan from University of Nottingham, who will be talking about the Berlin squatting movement in the 1990s, and Patrick McGuinness from the University of Oxford, who will explore naturalism and decadence in 19th century literature. We'll also have live and interactive performances by artist Caroline Locke and the musical collective Surfacing. I look forward to seeing you at future events, and I'll hand over to Eleanor.
Thank you very much, Abby, and thanks to everyone here at Nottingham Contemporary for inviting me this evening to introduce this special evening of films of Maya Deren and also to talk a little bit about her work. This evening we're going to be seeing 4 of Deren's films projected on 16mm, which is a real treat. So we hope for a smooth technological running, but obviously all the little seams and such are part of the medium, so that's part of the fun. Things tend to happen when Deren is involved. I had a rather interesting train journey today that involved getting stuck on a train and it taking the whole day to get here because of some stolen cable wire. It's a very strange and enigmatic reason to be on a train all day, but things do tend to happen when Deren's involved. It's a really apposite time to be sort of thinking about and celebrating Deren's work, and the inclusion of Meshes of the Afternoon in Klaus Weber's exhibition is also really apposite because we are in the year of the 50th anniversary of Deren's death. Maya Deren died in October 1961 at the age of just 44, following a series of cerebral hemorrhages at home in New York. There were rumours that voodoo had something to do with it. Deren was a voodoo initiate and had spent much time in Haiti documenting ritual activity and filming anthropological ritual activity on 60mm film. But it's probably more likely that drugs had something to do with it, and also malnutrition unfortunately took her at a very young age, leaving just a slight but really important body of work. Deren, but in her lifetime, between making Meshes of the Afternoon, which was her first film that she made in collaboration with her husband, the Czech documentary filmmaker and photographer Alexander Hamid, between then and her death in 1961, she completed and released just 6 films, but she began work on several others. There are coffee canisters at Anthology Film Archives in New York that hold, according to the director of Anthology, Jonas Mikas, the holy grail of cinema. No one knows what's in here. So they could include all sorts of fascinating things. So she made and completed 6 films. She spent time in Haiti documenting Haitian voodoo dance-based ceremony, committed the ceremony of voodoo to over 20,000 feet of 16mm film, which remained unedited in her lifetime, but was posthumously edited by her husband at the time of her death, the Japanese composer Teiji Ito, who made the soundtrack that is on the print of Meshes of the Afternoon that's shown in Klaus's exhibition. And that soundtrack was actually added, and it was Deren's decision to add a soundtrack to Meshes of the Afternoon. And she added that in 1959, just 2 years before she died, when she was at a time when she was really thinking about withdrawing Meshes of the Afternoon from programmes. It's the film with which Deren is most commonly associated, but it's also her most troubling film. Well, it was for her most troublesome, because it was commonly depicted as being and described as being either Freudian or poignantly surrealist, descriptions which she absolutely negated with everything she had. And whenever anyone would show the films, any organisation or gallery, she would send a disclaimer in capitals: under no circumstances is this film to be described as surrealist or Freudian. So the effort of adding a track to the film was a way of sort of bringing out the depersonalised, ritual, archetypal, maybe even folkloric element that she really wanted to put across when making that film. So it's really intriguing that Meshes of the Afternoon has been included in an exhibition that's really looking at pieces of work that chime with the archaic, with the obsolete, with the forgotten and maybe the ruined. Because Deren's Meshes, and in fact Deren's work across the body of her career, is both sort of revered and ignored, kind of celebrated and reviled. So she's in a really interesting position. I'm just going to talk a little bit about her biography. So she was born in 1917 to bourgeois-educated parents in Kiev in the Ukraine. The family moved to the US in 1922 following the threat of a series of anti-Semitic pogroms in Kiev, and Deren attended international school in Geneva, whilst her father Solomon, who was a prominent psychiatrist, was training for an American medical degree. He later took a position in Syracuse in upstate New York, at a place called the State School for Mental Defectives, which sounds quite worrying. She was an extremely prodigious and very prolific scholar and writer, and she matriculated at Syracuse University at the age of just 16 with ambitions to be a journalist. She also wrote much poetry, and much of this is documented in a fantastic biographical project commissioned by Anthology Film Archives called The Legend of Maya Deren, that includes extensive archival material, including poems, juvenilia, and writings. It's really a fascinating book to look at. So she goes to Syracuse University and she meets Gregory Bardaker, and Gregory Bardaker was a union organizer and a socialist. She met him. He was actually a family friend, but she came back into contact with him at Syracuse, and then she became actively involved in radical socialist politics. This was a passion of hers that continued on into her early 20s when she moved to New York with Gregory, and she joined the Yipsels, who are the Young People's Socialist League, as their national secretary in New York. And she finished up her studies there at NYU. She then returned to Syracuse and was a regional organizer for the Yipsels, and she conducted various kind of socialist training camps, which similarly sound, don't know much about those, but she conducted socialist training camps and then took up an MA position at Smith, the women's only college in Massachusetts, where she wrote a thesis on the influence of French symbolism on the poetry of the Anglo-American writers, so on Eliot, on Pound, H.D., and on the Imagist School. Following her time at Smith, she became really interested in dance and anthropology. She'd always had a nascent interest in dance, and she was really interested in the occult, having spent some time working as an editorial assistant to the noted occultist and controversial field worker William Seabrook in the late 30s. So her imagination turned to dance, and it turned to anthropology, and it turned to the idea of ritual and collectivity. So she sought a position with a noted African-American choreographer called Katherine Dunham, who at the time was running the only sustaining and self-financing company just for black dancers in the US. So she was really here putting herself at the vanguard of something really progressive in the performing arts. She became Katherine Dunham's editorial assistant, wanting to produce documents with Dunham about dance and ritual, and one of her first ideas, one of the first turns of Deren's imagination towards the expression of her ideas via the moving image was that she wanted to collaborate with Dunham on the creation of a flick book, where she would reproduce stills that Katherine Dunham had taken of Balinese and Haitian dance activity that she'd filmed in the late 30s and reproduced them in the corner of the book such that the child who's engaging with the book could kind of ripple a sort of movie off by running their finger through the book. And it was at a party for the Dunham Company that Maya Deren met Alexander Hamid, with whom her husband, who became her husband, who she collaborated with on the making of Meshes of the Afternoon. And Hamid taught Deren how to use a Bolex. He taught her the mechanics of filmmaking. But it's a film, and if you haven't already seen it yet in the group show, go and have a look. It's a film that Deren initially made. It's shot in their bungalow, in the bungalow that Hamid and Deren shared in the Hollywood Hills. And originally, Deren had wanted to make a film that was about the subjective view of moving around a space, of the way that she accessed the space on her own and the way that she saw it. And as Hamid was a filmmaker, this is really how she wanted to express her ideas. So she said, as the anecdote goes, she said to Hamid, "I want to make a film," and so they did. And Meshes of the Afternoon was the result. And it's extremely influential. And it was the film, it can be imagined as Deren's vision expressed via Hamid's tutelage. The first film that we're going to see this evening in the programme, we're not going to see Meshes because that's in the show, and it's good incentive to go see the show if you haven't already, or to go and see it again if you have. The first film we're going to see is called At Land, and this was the first film that Deren made where she had complete artistic control. It was still a collaboration with Hamid. He collaborated with her on the cinematography, but she put together the idea for this film. She made a very tight script for it. She knew exactly the image she wanted to obtain. And like in Meshes, this film features Maya Deren in the role of protagonist. And it can be seen as a real extension of some of the imagery and ideas put forward in Meshes. And it's a real kind of crystallization of the sort of burgeoning of Deren's filmic technique, especially her style of having a kind of continuous trajectory of the body that's cut across disparate locations or unrelated spaces. So the movement of the body is what holds these spaces together. And that's something that's common across all of Deren's films. This is what you might call one of her signature conceits or tropes. So in this film, we have a woman played by Deren, and apparently she knew she wanted this image, so she played the protagonist herself, and she suffered from apparently a reoccurring ear infection for weeks afterwards because, as you'll see in the opening frames, she plays a sort of archetypal folkloric woman who emerges from the waves and goes off in pursuit of her own kind of autonomy or identity as a woman. So we're going to watch At Land. I'm going to give a really short introduction to the films that follow, but let's have the first film, please. Thank you. So that was At Land that Deren made in 1944, the year after completing Meshes of the Afternoon. She returns to many of the themes that she explored in Meshes of the Afternoon in At Land, namely that she plays the protagonist. And at the end of the film, you'll see that she explores the idea of the multiple Mayas, or the multiple sort of archetypal women in the film, because you have the Maya that runs down the beach clasping the queen chess piece, the one that, it's worth noting, has the freedom of movement across the board, which is quite interesting. The Maya that remains at the chess game, and the Maya that is still kind of clambering away from their cocktail party. So she was really exploring some of the ideas that she explored in Meshes, but taking them on in her own image and in her own vision. By the time she made the next film that we're going to see this evening, which is called Ritual and Transfigured Time, Deren had established herself as something of a cinematic linguist, and she'd been writing since around 1945 extensive articles, papers and thematic statements on what film as an art form really was. And she dramatically narrowed the scope of what she believed film should be if it was to be considered an art form. So she considered that art film should be non-narrative, non-autobiographical, but also not diary-based, but that it should try and be, at all possible costs, that experience that is poetry, which is a quote of Deren. By the time she comes to make Ritual and Transfigured Time, she's established herself not just as a cinematic linguist, but as a filmmaker in her own right. And she's sort of shed, I think, some of Alexander Hamid's influences on her filmmaking. Ritual and Transfigured Time was made around the time that Deren's thoughts had turned to going to Haiti to do her own fieldwork into Haitian voodoo ceremonial dance. She applied, the year that Ritual and Transfigured Time was released, in 1946, she applied to the Solomon Guggenheim Foundation for the first ever kind of genius award for creative work in the motion pictures. And she'd wanted to make a film that was exploring the cross-cultural relation between Western children's games and Balinese ritual dances and activity. And this film, Ritual and Transfigured Time, is really a kind of replete articulation of this idea of a ritual poetics. She extends this notion of the body being the kind of continuous reality and of movement through disparate spaces that's achieved through editing, through manipulation of the filmic instrument, into the idea of social life, of identity being something that is held together in a kind of choreographic pattern. So she begins to turn her attentions here to a kind of choreographic filmmaking, or a sort of dance filmmaking. Ritual and Transfigured Time was shot on Long Island. Ritual and Transfigured Time was shot in a hotel where Deren invited her friends to come and have a cocktail party with her. And as you'll see, there's a very kind of long, protracted dance sequence that is actually a sort of dance of social niceties and greetings. And this is achieved really through the choreography of the filmic instrument. So we'll have a look at Ritual and Transfigured Time now. Thank you. That was Ritual and Transfigured Time. The frames, the scenes at the end that are shot in the negative were inspired by Deren having found some astronomical footage at the Museum of Natural History, and she was so inspired by the sort of choreographic quality of the movement of stars and constellations that she was inspired to produce something that involved a negative image. So what we see at the end there, Rita Christiani, who plays the kind of protagonist in Ritual, was a dancer with the Dunham Company. And that film also features Frank Westbrook, who was a dancer and choreographer, and also John Cage is in the composer John Cage is in the social sort of cocktail party scene as well. So it's a real example of Deren casting from her social circle, which she did in her early films. So the scene at the end there, we see Rita Christiani, who appeared in The Widow's Weeds after the first scenes, transforming into a bride. And the film is really was Deren's exploration of this kind of ritual idea of a metamorphosis of passage, or a kind of metamorphic rite of passage between states of being. And it's really also about a one woman's search for her own kind of sexual identity. In the film, we see Deren experimenting with this idea of the choreography, of what the camera was capable of creating as a choreography, alliteration there. And she uses the freeze frame, as you saw, to kind of imply this sort of move between the statue and the live. And by the time she'd made Ritual, she was really had quite a lot of forte in getting her own film seen, and they were regularly presented at film screenings that she would organise in New York, either private screenings at her home, where she would have parties and then invite her friends and charge them $1 after the party because they got to see her films. And she also organised her own screenings of her body of work to that point at venues such as the Provincetown Playhouse and the Bleecker Street Cinema in New York. Regularly, these screenings around the mid-40s would sell out completely, often with huge crowds outside the door. She was an excellent self-promoter, and really had a lot of audacity when it came to getting her own work seen, and she had an enormous amount of belief in herself as an artist. And she moved in very kind of strategic circles. So in Atlant, we also have Gregory Bateson, who is a prominent British anthropologist, Philip Lamantia, who's a surrealist poet, and John Cage appears in Atlant as well. So the next film we're going to see is quite interesting. We're going to go back in time to 1943. After making Meshes of the Afternoon, Deren and Alexander Hamid were separated for a time because he went to work as director of motion pictures for the Office of War Information. So Deren went off to New York, where she had previously lived, and spent time living in the East Village, making friends with people such as André Breton, the exiled Marcel Duchamp, and also the Chilean surrealist painter Roberto Matta. So she was moving in these, particularly kind of surrealist circles in New York around the end of the 30s. So she moves to New York in 1943 after the making of Meshes with the bug for making films, or the fever for it. And she sets about making the film that we're going to see next, only it's not really a film. It's a collection of outtakes. The film that she tried to make quite by herself, as she puts it in her notes, is called The Witch's Cradle, and it was inspired by the architecture of Peggy Guggenheim's recently opened Art of this Century Museum that opened in 1942, the year previously. Deren was inspired to make a film in this particular environment that included works of art, especially in the Surrealist galleries, that included some of the key works of art of the time, but also the Surrealist architectural environment for the display of the works that was created by the architect Friedrich Kiesler. And Deren, for Deren, the placement of these objects in this particular architecture, for her, really constituted a strange and magical world, as she puts it in her notes. And she thought that the Surrealist art object was the Kabbalistic sort of archetype of the time, the Kabbalistic object of the time, and then it held this particular sort of significance that might have been held for the kind of pentagram or the sort of oracle object for the feudal magicians and witches. As I mentioned before, Deren was really intrigued and interested in witchcraft and spent time working with William Seabrook, and had quite a sort of sticky time with him and kind of fled his barn before being captured by him. It's quite an odd story. But she was obviously, I think, in this film that only exists now as this really enigmatic collection of outtakes, exploring some of these ideas about witchcraft and trying to bring them into dialogue with contemporary practice. It was never released for various reasons, I'm not sure why. So what we're going to see now is a print of the shots that Deren stored in a coffee canister in her home. So they were never edited together as a final piece. So it's kind of up to us really to move our way through it. The film features Anne Matter-Clark, who was the mother of Gordon Matter-Clark, and it was supposed to also feature Roberto Matter, the Surrealist painter. He's not in this particular edit. Right at the start of the film, there's a blink and you'll miss him shot of Marcel Duchamp, so pay attention, he's in the film. The environment that Deren creates inside Guggenheim's gallery is one that's based on Duchamp's Mile of String installations that he installed for the first Papers of Surrealism exhibition curated by Breton that was going on down the road. So have a look, see what you think. Okay, we'll have the third film, thank you. So we've come to the last film of our programme this evening, and this is some outtakes again, but this time it's outtakes or rejected material rather than outtakes of a film that Deren completed in 1945 called A Study in Choreography for Camera. Now, this was a film that starred a dancer called Tally Beattie that Deren met while she was working with the Dunham Company. And it was Deren's effort to really sort of explore what the filmic medium could bring to the choreographic medium. And this film has been described as choreo cinema by, it was the term choreo cinema was coined for it by John Martin, who was dance critic for the New York Times at the time of its making. And what Deren really wanted to do was she was bringing out her interest in dance through cinema and really sort of exploring the relationship between the solo dancing body and the film camera to see what could be produced in terms of a new medium that she described as dance film or filmic dance. This is, I think, a really beautiful collection of outtakes because it shows the kind of material that Deren was selecting from. You can watch the completed film. It only runs to about 3 minutes long and it's on YouTube, dare I say it. But you can go home and watch it. But it's a really beautiful study of the solo dancing body and a real sort of example of what editing and also what techniques that Deren was beginning to explore in 1945, such as the use of slow or accelerated camera motion that were both really important to her, camera motor motion. Also the use of cutting movement across the splice, as has been discussed before, in order to kind of assume that the dancing body has a way of kind of accessing the sort of world or a dream world as they move. So this will be the last film that we'll see this evening, and then afterwards, if you've got any questions, we'll have a little bit of time for those. So thank you, everyone. I think we've got time for a few questions, but can I just ask that you just put your hand up so that we can get the roving mic to you, which I think we've got over here. So if you wait until you get the roving mic to ask your question, that would be brilliant. Any questions? That last frame was in Deren's apartment, by the way, on Morton Street, and Stan Brackage lived there with her for a time. Just a little fun fact.
Hello.
Hi.
Um, you said that she thought film art shouldn't be autobiographical. What about her explorations of identity? Is it more kind of the theme of identity and identity in general, or is it herself?
Yeah, I think it's more, I mean, in her writing, she talks about this idea of depersonalization that she takes from her sort of interest in ritual and in ritual ceremony, especially from voodoo in Haiti, in which the individual is sort of part of a collective whole, and their drives aren't sort of the conscious or the ego in the way that we would understand it. So when she's exploring identity, she's exploring it as a sort of archetypal identity, or maybe, you know, for example, in the Ritual and Transfigured time film, I think she's really sort of looking at how a woman, in almost a sort of mythical sense, can go on a journey where they become free of the kind of strictures of social life and the conventions of marriage and the kind of, you know, conventions that society is trying to place on them, by returning to this common motif in her work, which is the ocean, the sea, where the woman becomes kind of reborn as a sort of underwater bride. So yeah, it's an archetypal idea, I think, in a kind of Jungian sense. Deren was really interested in Jung and really interested in the idea of archetypes. So she was her characters were always personages rather than personalities, if that kind of, yeah, if that makes sense. Thanks. I can't see, so I'm going to, yeah.
Hello. You mentioned that she used her own home, or maybe friends' homes, to do the filming, but also invited people there for screenings.
Mm-hmm.
Where else would her work have been shown?
She showed it in salons and film societies, but the main two venues that she showed her early work in, so all the work that we've seen this evening was before she went to Haiti in 1947. And after she went to Haiti, things became markedly more abstract. She only completed 2 more films. And her endeavours at getting her work shown kind of depleted because she was really concentrated on her kind of religious sort of endeavours, really. But during that time, after making Witch's Cradle, so sort of 44 up until 47, she was really active in New York at getting her films screened. So she would screen them at her home and parties and at privately organised screenings. But mainly the 2 venues were Provincetown Playhouse and Bleecker Street Cinema in New York, where she had contracts. And they would sell out all the time because she was really excellent at marketing and promoting her work. And she vehemently believed that the artist should always be present to present their work, should be always present to introduce their work. So there's a really great collection of kind of thematic statements and programs she put together to introduce the works. A bit later on, during the 40s, she started to tour the work around, largely around universities in America, and she would write to them and offer to lecture for them, and then she would screen her work. So she was really prodigious at getting this stuff out. She really worked hard to make sure that it was seen. So she was quite kind of popular and did well in her own lifetime.
Thank you.
I have a question which relates to something that you mentioned at the beginning about Deren's refusal to categorise herself as either part of the Surrealist movement or to be part of this kind of Freudian filmmaking. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I think Deren was really keen on being the only person that did what she did. So she moved herself away from the description of her films as surrealist, partly because she wanted to invent a sort of mythology that only revolved around her. I mean, she wrote really extensively about what her films were about, and they were really rooted in the kind of mythic and the poetic, which were the poetry being a concern of hers from her MA year and something that she really brought to bear in her filmmaking. But when she writes about it about the surrealism thing in essays and in her notes, she says that the reason that she couldn't kind of deal with the moniker surrealist is because she says her films don't deal within registers of the irrational. There's a really great quote of hers where she says, I put real toads in imaginary gardens. So for her, this was the cinematic medium gave an access to something that wasn't irrational or illogical, but something that existed in the kind of dream sense, and what cinema was doing was enabling it to be projected as a reality. So because she didn't deal in kind of registers of the irrational or what she termed the kind of psychoanalytic, she distanced herself and wanted to sort of, move away, because she considered surrealism to be also about a spontaneity of expression. And she would write a shooting script where she really strove for an image, and she created it from as if she was kind of writing a poem, where she was really going for a certain kind of image via her filmmaking, as like a poet would with language. So nothing was left to the accidental. Oh, with that, I can't see. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. No worries.
Just sticking with this theme of categorization as well, I was just wondering if it seemed like a lot of the sort of themes in her work were to do with the examination of perhaps women's social standing or status within society. I wonder if you could align her with the feminist movement, although she's obviously decades before, or if you would consider her to be an early feminist.
I definitely do. I think she's really, really important to feminist filmmaking and to the feminist project. Although she wasn't necessarily brought into dialogues with the sort of feminist film theory. Laura Mulvey, for example, doesn't talk about her at all. But she was a woman who was financing her own films, who was not just financing her own films, but was helping to finance others. And she really kind of presented a model for a woman who was doing, something with, her own kind of impetus, her own onus. I think the surrealist question is really interesting in relation to her kind of feminist standing, because one of the reasons as well, I think, that she sort of disaligned herself from surrealism is that she didn't want to be branded a kind of female hysteric within what she saw as quite a patriarchal discourse, and that's or a patriarchally kind of controlled arena of production, and that's surrealism. But yeah, I think she was. And it's interesting, this question's quite interesting, because the film Witch's Cradle was the print you saw in the frame at the end in the closing credits, that it's distributed by the London Filmmakers Co-op. At the end of the 1970s, there was an exhibition at the Hayward Gallery called Film as Film, Formal Experiments in Film, that Liz Rhodes, who was a member of the London Filmmakers Co-op, really important filmmaker, who's actually got an exhibition coming up at ICA in January, which should be amazing. She was on the board for this exhibition, and the idea was that her and women from the London Filmmakers Co-op, working with the Co-op, were going to present their own work alongside research into women filmmakers that they felt had been written out of history. So the three filmmakers they focused on were Deren, Germaine Dulac, who was a feminist filmmaker from the 30s who's really important to the feminist project, and also I guess her films could be described as surrealist, but there's something called cinema pure. They're really interesting. And Alice Guy, who is one of the first filmmakers from early cinema. And what they wanted to do was present this really important research that they'd done into these women that they felt had been written out of history, and present it alongside contemporary work. As protest at there being a lack of female representation on the board for this exhibition, they withdrew and left their space dark. So they left the women's cinema space dark, and instead made a statement in the catalogue that presented their research into Deren. So it's interesting that the Co-op, around the time they then broke away from the Co-op, these particular women filmmakers, British filmmakers, Annabel Nicholson, Liz Rhodes, amongst them, broke away and formed their own group called Circles in the late 1970s. And they really did a lot of important research into Deren and really tried to reclaim her for the feminist project, and I think did some really important work, because their project was to consider Deren within the context of her own concerns, something that hadn't really been done before. She'd always been discussed through the kind of major hierarchical avant-garde criticism. So they were doing research into her Haitian activities, into her efforts as an advocate for avant-garde film practices in the 50s. So yeah, I think she's hugely important, although possibly has been neglected somewhat. Yeah. A bit rambling, but yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think we've got time for about one more question, if anybody has.
More.
Sorry, I know that Deren is also often talked about as one of the founders of underground and alternative filmmaking in the United States. And I just wondered, I've thought about this before, I suppose, and I just had this idea that her ideas, the kind of feminism you're talking about, is possibly one of the reasons why that underground was very receptive from the start to kind of issues to do with gender and sexuality, and I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
It's interesting, actually. I was just reading something. When Deren, in the early 50s, Deren was really instrumental in the forming of the film cooperative model in New York. And along with colleagues and friends and peers of hers, such as Willard Mass and Brackage, he was quite young at the time, to a lesser extent, Willard Mass's wife, Marie Mencken, and others who were involved in making film in New York at that time, Deren put out a call and she formed this thing called the Independent Filmmakers Association. It was first called something like the Film Artists Society. It became the Independent Filmmakers Association. And then this group would meet and discuss and exhibit work. Later on, Deren formed her own group called the Creative Film Foundation. So she was a voice, one of many, in the IFA, but for the Creative Film Foundation, she had sole and total control. And one of the things that kind of galvanized the formation of this group was a meeting of Jonas Mikas, who's the director of Anthology Film Archives at the time, a journalist for Village Voice, a filmmaker, a curator. They all got together to kind of protest against kind of homosexual discrimination in the art world, really. And that was something that kind of really galvanized them together as a group. It's interesting because she didn't really have a lot of time or support for fellow female filmmakers. She didn't kind of, there's a great quote that Marlon Brando talks about, you've got to send the lift down for the next guy. She didn't send the lift down for the next woman. Shirley Clarke, who's a filmmaker who was Deren's contemporary, younger than Deren, who really sort of looked up to her, once apparently phoned Deren and said, I've been asked to curate this thing, it's about dance film. Could you just give me some advice, about American dance film? Deren responded with the line, I am the American dance film, and put down the phone. She wanted to be the one amongst them all. She was a very difficult and kind of all-consuming woman, taken to massive rages. Apparently once, according to an anecdote by Stan Brakhage, threw a fridge across a wedding in a rage. She's also hugely not a fan of Dylan Thomas's wife, Caitlin, because she felt that Caitlin was too flirtatious and a drunkard, and Deren abhorred drunks. And Caitlin came and destroyed all of Deren's priceless Haitian vases at a party or something. But she was very singular in being the only woman who did what she did at the time. Later on in her career, so towards the end of her life, she starts to really bring kind of feminist discourse into what she's talking about at film societies and lectures. In a lecture that she gave to Smith College, her alma mater, in about 1961, the few months before she died, she says, come on, girls, get together. You've got to start making movies. What's all this business about becoming housewives? That's no good. Get a Bolex. It's far easier to use than a washing machine. And she does this real kind of, come on, ladies, you can all do it. Just get a little Bolex. It will be fun. And she does this almost sort of domesticated, kind of quite cute and twee, but it's still a call. It's a call to women, come on, get up, get up, get an instrument in your hand, not an appliance in your hand. And it's quite interesting, but it's really one of the first times that she kind of gets herself together behind the feminist project. It's quite ambivalent, the rest of the time. But she definitely wanted to be who she was. So that's gone roundabout to answering your question. I think kind of yes and no is the answer. She definitely made it easier for women to become filmmakers because she was such a huge presence and she did what she wanted to do. So she cleaved a space out, if you will, I think, but not necessarily because she held the torch for it. Thank you, everyone, and thanks to, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and and do go and see the exhibition if you haven't seen it. And if you're interested in Deren, BFI Film Classics have just produced a really great small book on Meshes of the Afternoon written by John David Rose from Sussex. It's a really, really good read, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in her and want to know a bit more about her background. But thank you all very much for coming.